This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to frequent guest Ryan S. Walters, author of The Jazz Age President, Defending Warren G. Harding book. Links to learn more about Ryan and his books can be found at ryans.walters.net or in the show notes. Did you know you can support Beyond the Big Screen podcast on Patreon and Subscribestar? By joining on Patreon or Subscribestar, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen going and become a part of the team. You get many great benefits as well. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen or subscribestar.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. Another really helpful way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help others learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies on various social media platforms by searching for A2Z History. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen.
I'd like to welcome Ryan S. Walters back to Beyond the Big Screen. Ryan is an independent historian and frequent guest of the show. Welcome back, and it's great to have you on again.
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's my third go-around, which I enjoy it. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. And Ryan is the author of several books, including Disaster at NASA, a book on Apollo 1. He is also the author of 2 books on Grover Cleveland. And you can listen to the episodes on both of these books, or all 3 of these books, and go back and buy the books as well. And all of that can be found in the show notes. But today we are going to talk about the 29th president of the United States, Warren G. Harding. And Ryan has written a book on Warren G. Harding on the Jazz Age President. Harding was president from March of 1921 to August of 1923. And this is a really interesting time in American history and political history. Now, to set the stage, we talked about Grover Cleveland in one of your previous appearances on the podcast, and Cleveland's presidency was during an age of great change. Cleveland was a Democrat and Harding was a Republican, but there seems to be some similarities that cross over in a lot of respects. What was happening in American politics during that roughly 20-ish years between Cleveland's presidency and Harding's presidency?
Yeah, that's something that has made a lot of news in recent years. The 2 parties seem to have switched places, at least on a lot of issues, from the 19th century to the 20th. And you're exactly right. Cleveland was a Jeffersonian Democrat. I call him the last Jeffersonian. He was really the last Democrat president that we had that espoused those ideals of limited government, states' rights, federalism, low taxes, low tariffs, no debt, things like that. A non-activist government, non-interventionist foreign policy. We don't associate any of that with the Democratic Party today. I mean, the Democratic Party, after Cleveland started to go left, beginning with William Jennings Bryan, who was nominated in 1896, and then it went to Woodrow Wilson and FDR. Both parties actually had conservative and liberal wings. It just depended on which one was dominating. Of course, as I said, the Democratic Party has just continued to go left a little more every time we get another Democratic president. But there's the conservative element began to dominate the Republican Party, beginning with Warren Harding. Before that, the Republicans were more progressive. There was a big progressive elements in the party. The previous Republican presidents were Roosevelt and Taft. They were certainly nothing like Warren Harding. But now you get this strong conservative wing that begins to dominate the Republican Party, beginning with Harding and Coolidge, and kind of went away with it with Hoover. But Harding was probably the most conservative Republican up until point, probably one of the most conservative Republicans we've ever had in the presidential office.
Can you, to set him up just a little bit, tell us a little bit about his early career and his pre-presidential career?
He didn't have a lot. He didn't serve a lot of time in office. He was not really a career politician. I think the total of all of his years of service was only about 15 years. Harding was born on November the 2nd, 1865, the year the Civil War ended. The Civil War had been over several months by the time he was born. Interesting factoid, he was actually elected on November the 2nd, 1920. He's the only president we've ever had that was elected on his birthday. He began his career, again, he wasn't born wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but he got into journalism first as a reporter, and he eventually, as a very young man, bought a newspaper, the Marion Star. He was in Marion, Ohio, and made it a very profitable enterprise. And that's sort of what got him into politics, because he got press passes to attend political conventions. He actually attended the first national convention he attended, the Republican National Convention, was in 1884. Interestingly, which is the year Grover Cleveland was elected. So he was at the convention that nominated James G. Blaine against Cleveland before. Kind of whetted his appetite for that. He served a couple of terms in the Ohio State Senate. Early in the 20th century, he served one term as Ohio's lieutenant governor. Lost a bid in 1910 for the governorship of Ohio, but he came back in 1914. Won a U.S. Senate seat, a 6-year term in the Senate, which would end in he would have to run for a second term, but he was given the presidential nomination that year at the convention, and then, of course, served 881 days as president of the United States.
What were some of the major issues that were confronting the parties and just in general in the U.S. at that point for the president to tackle?
And this is something that I spend a lot of time on in the book. This is not a full biography of Warren Harding. I don't go into a lot of his background, but there is some. If you don't know much about him, you can certainly pick that up in the book. But I start the book with the fight over the League of Nations in 1918. And you really have to understand Harding and Harding's election. You have to put him in the proper context. And there's a reason Harding, and a man like Harding, and his vice presidential candidate, Calvin Coolidge, was elected because of what was going on in the country. And you really have to go back to the previous 20 years. The country had been in a progressive tide for the previous 20 years, from Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and then, of course, Woodrow Wilson. A lot of progressive reforms were going on. There was a lot of change for the people over that year period, culminating in Woodrow Wilson's crusade in Europe, World War I. A lot of historians try to say, well, progressivism really died in 1917 when we entered the war. No, absolutely not, in my opinion. World War I was a progressive war. It was for, a war to make the world safe for democracy, a war to end all wars. Those are progressive ideals. When you look at what progressivism was about, we just moved it to Europe. That's all we've done. And so coming out of the war, you get the Treaty of Versailles, you get the fight over the League of Nations, and Harding was in the Senate. The Senate had to approve that treaty with the League of Nations. I go into that story. Woodrow Wilson would not compromise on that whatsoever. And of course, the problem is the League had in the charter, it was in the treaty, we would have to send troops if we were a member of the League of Nations. If somebody attacked a member nation, we were obligated to send troops to defend them. And the Republicans had won control of the Congress in 1918 in November, about the time this fight was really getting going, about the time the war started, and Wilson was preparing to go to Versailles into 1919 and do this. And when the League came out in 1919, and they saw it, the Republicans in the Senate saw that and said, hey, wait a minute, you're taking away the power of Congress to determine when we go to war. We'll be obligated to do that. That was really one of the biggest issues throughout 1919 in that fight. And so Henry Cabot Lodge, who chaired the Foreign Relations Committee, Warren Harding was a senator on that committee, and he was a big part of that. He went with Lodge down to the White House. They sat down with Wilson to try to work out something on this treaty. Wilson wouldn't budge. And of course, when it was time to debate the treaty on the Senate floor, Harding was given the role of the leading speech, kicking off the Republicans' displeasure at the League of Nations. And of course, they ended up voting on it twice, voting it down both times. So we never entered the League. Right in the middle of all of that, Woodrow Wilson has a severe stroke. He's really taken out of office for about 9 months. That was kept secret from the people. His wife, Edith, was really running the White House. A lot of people say she was probably the first female president we've ever had. I mean, she was really running things, and people realized that. Wilson was incapacitated. Throughout 1919, along with the League fight, you've got horrific racial violence that's going on. They call it the Red Summer because of the lynchings and things against Black people across the country. You've got labor strikes. You've got terroristic bombings that began at the latter part of 1918. I mean, the Bolshevik groups and things like that. I mean, the Attorney General of the United States, his house was bombed. Labor strikes, all kind of things that was going on in the country. Then you move into 1920. What happens? We get a major depression. It strikes in January of 1920. It's called the Forgotten Depression. Unemployment went up to 12%. Industrial production falls considerably. Stocks fall. All the things you see in a depression. So that's the kind of country that he inherited. Well, those are the things that were going on when he ran for president in 1920 and was elected. So it's not like there was nothing going on and he had a really easy time. He had a lot to deal with when he entered office on March the 4th, 19.
Harding ran against a fellow named James Cox, who had kind of a similar background to Harding. He was from Ohio, a newspaper man. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about him and contrast Harding and Cox on what they were running on in that election?
Yeah, Cox, that's interesting because you got Harding, a U.S. Senator from Ohio. Cox was the sitting governor of Ohio, so sort of like a battle of Ohio. And both of them, as you mentioned, were newspaper men. Harding owned a newspaper, the Marion Star. Cox actually owned two newspapers. It's the only election we've ever had in American history, pitting two journalists against each other, two newspaper men against each other. Of course, the problem with Cox, and of course, he's a Democrat, a little more progressive Democrat. Harding's running his campaign return to normalcy. All of this chaos, the war, the League, the progressivism, all of the Depression, Red Summer, all of that stuff, it's time to get back to normalcy. And it was a perfect slogan, something that people were really eager to do. Cox finds himself hooked to Woodrow Wilson because Wilson actually wanted the nomination. He wanted the third term, even though he had suffered the stroke and was hoping to get it. Of course, they didn't give him the nomination and he went to Cox. But Wilson wanted the League of Nations on the ballot. He wanted to make the 1920 election a referendum on the League of Nations. And of course, Cox is sitting there. What do you do? I mean, the sitting president is of my party. I can't really go against him. So he's kind of in that position of having to run on the League, and the people did not want the League of Nations. I mean, Harding and Lodge and the Republicans were 100% right. This is before polling, but they knew the mood of the country. And of course, and it's interesting to note, Cox's running mate was a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They put the Roosevelt name on the ticket. This is before he had polio. So he was out actively campaigning. They campaigned across the country. But again, people had had enough of Wilsonism and progressivism and the League, and Cox really didn't have a chance in that election. Wilson, right to the end, said, we're going to win. People are not going to elect Warren Harding. Of course, Warren Harding gets over 60% of the vote in the first year that women are allowed. So most women voted for Warren Harding because they wanted to return to normalcy as well.
It's a little interesting factoid, but I was wondering if you maybe found something in your research. Cox's wife, her maiden name was Harding. Were they of any relation?
That's an interesting fact. I'm not too sure about that. I never saw anything about that. They might have been. Could have been. That put a little interesting Family Feud twist on there. Too bad. Well, you got to remember, in these days, there wasn't a lot of active campaigning. Cox and Roosevelt did a lot. They went around the country. Harding did a little bit. Harding mainly ran that old-fashioned front porch campaign there in Marion. His house is still there. You can go to it. They just recently restored it. And he had a lot of people that just came to his house, and he would stand out there on the porch and give speeches. He did a little bit of campaigning, but this is sort of the end of that old era of not going out and doing a lot of active seeking. Because I think, again, this is before polls, but parties and party operatives were very good in those days of kind of gauging what the public how it was going to go. So I don't think Harding was too worried about it. Everything, the tide was with him, so he didn't really have to go out and, sling mud and trash anybody. That's not his way. So he just kind of ran the front porch campaign. And again, as one newspaper said, this wasn't a landslide, it was an earthquake. It really was.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Harding walks in and the Great War, World War I's over, but then he walks into a fairly devastating depression occurs right after the war during 1920 to 1921. How did he handle that?
Yeah, he handled that with laissez-faire conservatism. And he's the last administration that handled the depression with laissez-faire or hands-off methods. In other words, conservative method. Now, when something happens, every time there's a downturn, what do we get? The government steps in and we got to stimulate the economy with spending, and we got to increase our welfare programs and our employment and those kind of things. There was no concept of that. This is before the New Deal. So he handled it the way they'd always handled depressions, which is with conservatism. So he comes in, he's got to remember what had happened during the war. Before 1913, we didn't have an income tax in this country, except a little bit in the Civil War tax. They tried it in 1894, but the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional, but you get the 16th Amendment. And in 1913, you get an income tax, which is not bad at all. You had to make, in our equivalency, somewhere around $80,000 to $100,000 a year in our money today to pay 1%. The Rockefellers and the Carnegies would have paid about 7% at the top. By 1918, the top rate was 77%. Right? It was tremendous. So Harding and the spending had gone through the roof. Our budget in 1916 was about $714 million in spending. 1918, 1919, it shoots up to almost $20 billion in spending. So Harding comes in and again, this is part of return to normalcy. Cut taxes, cut spending, reduce regulations, unshackle the economy from the government takeover during World War I, progressive era. So the tax cuts, again, he appointed an outstanding Treasury Secretary named Andrew Mellon. Coolidge was the vice president. In those days, vice presidents were pretty much shunned, but Harding actually began to transform the vice president into the modern role. He actually brought Coolidge into the discussions, into cabinet meetings to help out. So Coolidge was part of this as well. And of course, taxes were reduced during the 1920s 4 times. The top rate went from more than 70% to 25%. Spending was cut in half. It had been reduced in 1919, I think, down to $6 million. Harding got it down to about $3 billion. Harding got it down to about $3 billion, about $6. And in 1918, it had been almost 20. So spending was, and some of that's the Army being mustered out of service, but and the people said, well, gosh, we went from $700 million to Harding's high, which is $3 billion. A lot of that was veterans. They were paying for veterans and veterans. The other thing they did was they raised tariffs. Wilson had lowered tariffs. He was more of a free trader, so they raised tariffs. But one of the reasons because Europe was in bad shape and they were trying to recover their economy by dumping cheap goods into our market. So they raised tariffs to stop the dumping. They cut immigration because we're trying to get jobs for people we have here. There were a whole host of really conservative things that happened. And of course, what we get is the boom of the 1920s, the roaring 20s. We've never had a decade with this much robust growth. I mean, consider it. The economy averaged 7% growth a year. Today, we're happy when we get 3. It averaged 7 throughout the decade. You get 4 tax cuts, but yet the revenue of the government grows. The budget is not only balanced every year in the 1920s, it is a surplus, and a third of the national debt was paid down. Debt had exploded. Debt was only a little more than $1 billion when Wilson took office, and the debt was catastrophic. It'd gone up about 25 times. So we had spent a lot, and Europe owed us $10 billion, which we never got back. They defaulted on that. So there was a lot of things that Harding had to straighten out, and he did it by conservative economic policy. There was no stimulation. There was no activist government involved.
What were some of the, because I get the sense that a lot of Harding's, that early part of his tenure was just cleaning up, that there was messes in foreign policy, messes in economics. What was going on in some of the other aspects of his government?
Yeah, there's you're right. That's a good word for it. Messes everywhere. Because foreign policy was in shambles, and I got a chapter on foreign policy. And he doesn't get very much credit for foreign policy, and he should, because Wilson had made a mess of foreign policy. So Harding came in, and again, he's looking at and he says it in his inaugural address. He said, we're not going to be concerned with the old world, meaning Europe, and being entangled in their messes. We're withdrawing from that. And so he formally ended World War I. He formally ended that war, formally. He withdrew troops from the Rhineland. We had troops in the Rhineland in Germany. He withdrew those. He called a foreign World War debt commission because the debts were so high. Europe owed so much money to us. And of course, with the other things, with the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations for Germany, it was just a big tangled up mess in Europe. So he called a World War debt commission to try to straighten some of the debt out. Again, nobody paid us back except Finland. So I always tell my students, always have a soft heart, a spot in your heart for Finland, because Finland paid us back. Everybody else defaulted on that. But the big thing he did was the Washington Disarmament Conference, also called the Washington Naval Conference. You got to remember the big weapons of the day were naval. And that was at least one of the causes of World War I, was a naval race and a naval buildup between Britain and Germany. That's one thing that was blamed on. And just, tremendous navies and battleships and that kind of, this is before air power really took hold. So he calls this conference, it's the first of its kind. We'd never participated in any type of disarmament. Called for Washington, and he opens it up, and there's a lot of good things that happened in that conference. So the navies of the world were reduced. There were limits placed on how much tonnage that people could have in their naval forces. There were a lot of treaties that were struck. I'll go through that in the book. Tensions in the Pacific were rising. Japan was not happy with a lot of things, and we had a lot of tension with Japan. And there were some treaties there to help open up China and relieve tension with Japan. One diplomatic scholar said that it probably averted war in the Pacific for a decade, the treaties though. So the Washington Naval Conference was very successful. Closer to home, Wilson had made a mess of foreign policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. We'd occupied a lot of areas there. Harding withdrew most of the troops from the Caribbean, restored our relationship with Mexico. They weren't real happy with Wilson at all, particularly with the whole Pancho Villa expeditions and stuff. There were a lot of bad blood there. And the president of Mexico praised Harding and said, I think this is good. We're rebuilding our relationship here, and this is a good step forward. So he did a lot of things he doesn't get credit for, restoring relationships and really trying to straighten out our foreign policy and return us back to their old foreign policy, which was non-interventionist. And we don't intervene in everybody else's, y'all handling your own messes. We're going to stay over here and handle ours. So that was part of return to normalcy too. People didn't want to see any more crusades anywhere. So he began retrenchment in foreign policy as well. And I'll point out, he was twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. That's a little factoid most people don't know.
Inside of the party, because you have a party that has, within that 20 years, Taft and Roosevelt, who are real progressives, and they pushed a lot of the big stick, the building up of the military. What was the reaction inside of the party? Was the party swinging at that point towards a non-interventionist policy?
I think World War I did a lot of that. And of course, World War I, there was a lot of excitement when the war ended, because the war ended really quickly, a lot sooner than people thought. We had lost over 100,000 troops from the time we entered the war. It was the summer of 1917 before we got any real measure of troops over there. Of course, it ends in November 1918. But they weren't expecting it to end until 1920. I mean, we were continuing to pour troops into France, but it sort of ended abruptly. Germany was in bad shape and sort of threw in the towel, which kind of shocked a lot of people in Germany. So people were really excited about that. Hey, we got this over with a lot quicker than we thought. But nobody really had the stomach to do this again. And Harding gets credit for the Washington Naval Conference, but there were a number of senators who had already had that notion. They were already saying, we need to have some kind of conference and look at disarmament as a possibility moving forward. Let's not do this again. Of course, one of the problems was the Treaty of Versailles was so bad. As one senator stated very clearly, he said, this is not the Treaty of Versailles, this is the Truce of Versailles. All we've done is delay the next war for the next 20 years. But they were looking for some way to avoid that. Let's try disarmament. Let's try withdrawing our troops. Let's not be entangled. So there are a lot of people in the party that were for that. I mean, that we're getting back into more of a quote unquote isolationist move, because you well know, when you get into the 30s and things are happening in Europe, public opinion polls by that time are showing 80 to 90% of the American people don't want any part of another Europe. So that's something that's running very strong, particularly in the Republican Party. It was not the interventionist party in those days. They were not in favor of intervention.
Theodore Roosevelt died about a year or so before this election. Did he have much to say about Harding, or this change away from really what he had built his whole idea on was a lot of intervention and a lot of strong foreign policy? Right.
This was one thing that surprised me, that Harding and Roosevelt had traded some letters. Roosevelt was considering running in 1920, was leaning very strongly into running in 1920. And most people contend if he had run, then he likely would have been the nominee. He probably would have been. you got to remember when he left the presidency and he tried to come back in 1912 and he was nearly elected. After that, he lost a son in World War I, and he went off and did all his, he did his, his safaris and hunts in Africa and things. And he went down to South America and explored this previously unexplored tributary of the Amazon, the famous River of Doubt. And he really got sick down there, and it really took a toll on him physically in his health. And he died early in 1919. He was actually in the hospital at the time. He'd gone into the hospital, not because he was going to die, but because he was having these complications. A lot of people contend it took years off of his life doing that Amazon. That's a tough place to go. It'd be tough for us to go today. I mean, I don't know that I would be tromping around in that. But he did, and it cost him a lot. But that would have been an interesting thing to see. And they had exchanged letters, and apparently Roosevelt was even considering Harding for a possible running mate if he did run. So he and Harding, even though they didn't really see eye to eye and they'd had some differences in the past, I think Roosevelt was looking at, hey, it's time to patch up our differences between progressives and conservatives and move forward as a more unified party instead of any more of these, bull moose rebellion.
One of the things that was kind of shocking to me is that Harding kind of took you might not say a soft role, but with people like Eugene Debs who were convicted of crimes for basically just being against World War I. What was Harding's thinking on giving some of these people a little bit of leniency?
Yeah, and I talk a lot in the book about Harding the man, how he really was. He was a very warm, kind-hearted, very forgiving, and he didn't like the fact that Wilson had jailed a lot of people for opposing World War I. I mean, it simply put them in jail. Eugene Victor Debs was one of them. Debs was a labor leader going back to the late 19th century, had a big role in the Pullman strike and had gone to jail over that. And you got to remember, people's thinking at that time was they began to associate labor unions and labor movement with socialism and communism. Remember what Marx had said, workers of the world unite, worldwide workers' revolution. People were apprehensive about radicals. And of course, in the early 20th century, for years and into 1919, you get all these bombings that these anarchist groups are responsible for and Bolshevik groups. So people are apprehensive about that. And of course, Debs is opposed to World War I. In the summer of 1918, in June, he gives a speech and denounces World War I and denounces Wilson, basically saying it's a class war. The master class always declares the war. It's the labor class, the common people. We're always the ones that die. The wealthy get away with it. It's, rich man's war, poor man's fight type of thing. Of course, there were federal agents listening because they'd passed not only laws against that Sedition Act, an Espionage Act that they had passed, the Wilson administration. And he was arrested and jailed and given a 10-year prison sentence because he gave a speech opposing World War I. And most people don't realize this happened in World War I. It did. There were people that were jailed for because there was one man who was jailed in his own house because he convinced one of his friends in his own house not to buy a Liberty Bond. Upton Sinclair went to jail because he stood out on a street corner and read the Bill of Rights out loud. Read the Bill of Rights out loud and went to jail. Debs, again, he was a socialist. He'd run for president several times, kind of a thorn in the side of Woodrow Wilson and a lot of others. And he got a 10-year prison sentence in Atlanta. He was in Atlanta. He's actually ran for president in 1920 against Cox and Harding and got nearly 1 million votes while he was in jail in Atlanta. Harding's position was this is not right. And he wanted to commute Debs' sentence. And he did so in December of 1921 during his first year. He decided to do that. He also freed 23 other people who were sitting in political prisoners. I mean, that's what they were. And his attorney general, Harry Doherty, said, I don't think this is a good idea, boss. And Harding wouldn't hear of it. He said, no, this is the right thing. He said, I'm going to do that. And he gave one stipulation on the pardon. He told Debs, he said, I'm going to do one thing. He said, I want you to come visit me in the White House. Now, who does that? This guy, they don't see eye to eye at all. But he invited Debs to the White House, and Debs showed up, and they had a nice little meeting. after the meeting, Debs told the press, Harding's how much of a kind and humane man Warren Harding. So that was the right thing to do because it began to restore domestic tranquility. I mean, it's a lot of bad blood with World War II, putting people in jail for exercising their right to free speech. He said, we've got to get all this straight out. And he did a lot of other things to heal the country in terms of race and other issues.
We'll start to get into some of the evaluation of Harding, but I think this is a good place to just maybe get your thoughts on why isn't Harding more recognized for, I mean, that's huge that he could have let somebody like Debs rot in prison. And for all intents and purposes, like you said, Debs and Harding were against each other on every issue. Why doesn't Harding get more credit for something that I think seems like a really big deal?
Yeah, the chapter that's in, I called it Harding the Healer, because he wanted to heal the wound. Anytime you have that kind of a problem with a war that's not as popular as people think, there's a lot of opposition to World War. And again, people getting thrown in jail. Again, you're passing an Espionage Act and a Sedition Act. Any interference with the military at all, even encouraging people not to register for the draft because we had a draft that would get you put in jail. And of course, you go into 1919, and there's a lot of violence there. The Red Summer of 1919, dozens of lynchings around the country for Black people, because a lot of Blacks, African American population in the South, they were having a pretty bad time. A lot of them had begun to move north in this great migration, and they were not welcome. There's some bad violence in Chicago and in other areas of the country. And he wanted to heal that as well. So he came in. Remember, Woodrow Wilson was a notorious racist. Woodrow Wilson resegregated Washington, D.C., threw Blacks out of jobs in Washington, D.C., tried to get a law passed to make racial mixing a felony inside the city. He was a white supremacist. There's no question about that. Harding was not. And it's an interesting story because Harding kind of got a little bit of taste of what Blacks go through, particularly in that time period, because the rumor was when Harding was growing up was that he had Black blood. And he was actually called the N-word as a kid. Actually, his father-in-law also called him that same thing. He didn't have a good relationship with his father-in-law. So he at least understood a little bit more of that. Of course, DNA has shown he did not have any after. But he said, we got to do something about civil rights. This is the party of Lincoln, and we haven't done anything. And so he called for civil rights for Black Americans. He called for an anti-lynching law to make lynching a federal crime. After 19, he went to Birmingham. Now you want to think about courage. Warren Harding travels to Birmingham, Alabama, the heart of the old Confederacy, gives a speech to a big audience, obviously a segregated audience, and said, we got to give equality to Black people. They deserve to be treated equal in the heart of the old Confederacy. Now, which president would do that? Not at that time period. And certainly not any Democrat would have dared do it. Few Republicans would have done it because none of them did. But he also went to an all-Black college in Pennsylvania called Lincoln College, spoke to the graduating class, and there were 400 students there that were graduating. He shook hands with all 400, which caused the college to, nobody had ever like that had ever come to their college to speak. No president had ever been there. And they said, this is the high watermark of our college. So he did a lot to heal the racial divide in the country, again, to heal the political divide in the country. And again, it goes back to the fact that he was not Woodrow Wilson at all. They were the polar opposite. I don't mean just politically, but their attitude. Wilson was this stuffy academic, arrogant, I'm smartest person in the room. Harding was not. Harding was a very humble guy. He was a very generous guy. He even told his friends, even when he was president, he said, I'm Warren Harding. I mean, I'm not Mr. President. Call me Warren. People in town and Marion, called him Warren. That's the way he liked it. He was that kind of guy. Loved animals, loved children. Very generous, helped people that were down on their luck in Marion. One New York Times reporter who did not like him at all in his memoirs wrote about him. And he said he'd gone to Marion to talk to people about Warren Harding. And he found all these incredible stories about how Harding had helped this family or that family and helped them with Christmas presents and did what he could to make life a little bit better for people that were down on their luck. And he said, I interviewed all these people in Marion. Everybody had a different story to tell, and nobody told the same story. They had their own to tell. So he was certainly that type of guy, which is what the country needed at that time to heal, not just economically, but the domestic tranquility.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
For all of these things that were really positive about Harding, it seems like if you ask somebody what's just the overall impression they have of Harding, and it comes down to the scandal, the Teapot Dome scandal and a few other scandals. What can you tell us about those scandals?
That is the black mark for his administration, and any administration was scandal. And we've had what administration does not have scandal? That's and again, it's how do you define scandal? Harding had 3 scandals in his administration. There was one in the Veterans Bureau, which was a new agency. There was one in the Justice Department, and then there was Teapot Dome. And here's the difference, though. Harding, and it's hard to judge Harding accurately because he died in office. After 881 days, he died on August 2nd, 1923. So it's kind of hard to judge him. Say, well, he didn't do anything about it. Well, he was in the process of doing something. The Veterans Bureau was headed by Charles Forbes, somebody Harding had met a few years before in Hawaii and had taken a liking to him, and he had named him to the Veterans Bureau. That was a new bureau. The idea had come during the Wilson administration, but it was signed into law by Harding. Creating this because we got a lot of veterans that are wounded coming home from France. We'll begin the construction of veterans hospitals. We really hadn't had anything like that up to this point. So that's one of the reasons why most of the budget was being spent on that. That's why wars are so bad. You just never quit paying for it. That's why he wanted to bring an end to war if he could. But Forbes was, skimming off the top. He had skimmed about $2 million off the construction of hospitals, overinflated prices for hospital supplies. And Harding confronted him in the White House over that. A New York Times reporter was in the White House and was going to waiting to see the president and walked in. And Harding, apparently, according to his memo that he wrote to his boss, he said Harding had Forbes by the throat and called him a double crosser. In his memo, he says he was shaking him like a dog would a rat. Forbes was fired and Forbes was prosecuted. Forbes went to prison for stealing. Now, the Justice Department was headed by Harry Doherty. And there's this notion that, and you see this all the time, I saw it in an article here a few weeks ago, that there was this quote unquote Ohio gang that Harding had in Washington. He brought from Ohio and they looted the treasury and all this kind of stuff. Well, Harry Doherty, the Attorney General, was the only one from Ohio, and Doherty's right-hand man, a guy named Jesse Smith. They were the only 2 guys that were from Ohio. There were other people from Ohio, but they weren't doing anything wrong. So there's no such thing as an Ohio gang. That's another myth that I try to knock down. But again, what they were doing was selling favors to the government. They were selling pardons. They were even selling liquor licenses. They were in Prohibition. Any goodies like that you wanted, you could bribe Jesse Smith. He was Doherty's right-hand man. Harding confronted Jesse Smith, and he said, "You're going to be arrested for this, and put your affairs in order." Well, Jesse Smith put his affairs in order permanently because he went home, burned his papers, and shot himself. Committed suicide. Teapot Dome involved naval oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. They were for the Navy. They were under the Department of the Navy, and they're reserves. They're for what the Navy needs oil for a time of war or something like that. They're not for private drilling. The Secretary of the Interior, who Harding had appointed, Albert Fall, who had been a senator as well. He was the Secretary of the Interior. He convinced the Navy Secretary to transfer those oil reserves to the Interior Department. And then once they were transferred under his control, he leased them to 2 oil men. Harry Sinclair got Teapot Dome. Edward Doheny got Elk Hills, California. And they were able to drill for the oil for themselves and their oil company. And of course, they bribed Albert Fall to do this. He got about $125,000 in cash, which was quite the hefty sum in those days. If you look at this and juxtapose it with other scandals throughout history, Teapot Dome was rather rich. Not that much, just a bribery case. The Supreme Court eventually restored the oil fields back to the government department. Again, Albert Fall was prosecuted. Albert Fall went to prison. He was the first cabinet officer to go to prison. However, that broke after Harding had already died. Harding found out about it on a westward trip that he took in the summer of 1923. Went all the way to Alaska. He was the first president to visit Alaska, came back down the west coast, where he died in San Francisco. He'd found out about it. Teapot Dome was beginning to break, and he actually met with Fall's wife. I think she kind of spilled the beans, said this is what he's up to. Because Fall was kind of broke. He had a ranch in New Mexico, and he was kind of down on his luck. Even as a senator, he wasn't making that much money. But, here's all this new money coming in, and everything in the ranch is looking really good. People wanted to know where it came from. And it really changed Harding's mood on that trip. Herbert Hoover was on that trip, wrote about it in his memoirs. Harding went to Hoover and said, what do I need to do about this? We got a scandal. Do I publicize it? Do I sit on it? What do I do? And Hoover says, we need to publicize it, at least get out ahead of it, get credit for it, which is likely what Harding was going to do. I think the reason he sat down with Hoover and asked those specific questions and asked for advice is because of the Jesse Smith episode where, hey, he confronted Jesse, and the guy goes home and kills him. There was also the attorney at the Veterans Bureau, a guy named Charles Kramer, also committed suicide over that scandal. So he's sitting there with 2 suicides on his hands. And I think he's wondering, what should I put this out there? How do I handle this? So I think that's probably what would have happened. That would have been dealt with as well. And this really exacerbated Harding. Harding was really in a depressed mood during that westward trip. And I think that's why. And he told a newspaper reporter named William White later on, he said, it's not my enemies. He said, I can handle my enemies. He said, it's my friends that keep me walking the floors at night. So, but the difference is, if you look at Grant's administration and other scandal-ridden administrations that didn't do anything about it, tried to cover it up, sweep it under, Harding didn't do that at all. He was actively doing something about it. And it's hard and unfair to judge him because he died, in the middle of his term before he could do anything.
Now, so that's in a lot of ways, he took care of those scandals, and you have to give him credit for that, even though he doesn't seem to get the credit. He was also accused of being a womanizer. And were those, so many of our presidents have been accused of being womanizers. And I guess the question is, did he engage in those quote unquote extracurricular activities, and did they impact his presidency?
Yeah, he again, if people ask me sometimes, what is your criticism of Harding? He did a lot of praising and defending Harding. What is your criticism? Well, obviously, he's responsible for who he names to office. You're responsible for that. I think he trusted people a little bit too much. Very trusting guy. As far as and he did have at least 2 extramarital affairs during his life before he became president. He married a woman named Florence Kling de Wolf in July of 1891. They never had any children. She had a son by a previous relationship. She had a common law husband who was an alcoholic, and she had to support herself, and she eventually married Harding. And she was very instrumental in making the Marion Star newspaper what it was, a very big money operation. So she gets a lot of credit for that. Again, as far as what their personal relationship was, I don't know, because they never had any children. And again, Harding had a couple of extramarital affairs that we know about. One of them, the infamous one, was Nan Britton, a very young girl that claimed that she had a daughter and the daughter was Harding. We now know from DNA that that's true. But this happened when Harding was a senator. There was none of that kind of stuff going on in the White House. Now, that's something that people say it's one of the myths about. You see these jokes in movies and things like that about Harding and all of his women. I mentioned that in one of the early chapters, the chapter called The Most Maligned President in History, that the jokes and things in films about Harding, which were not true. They were just political attacks at the time that carried forward, and they've become quote unquote facts today. He did not have any of that kind of stuff going on there. The rumors was he had all these girls and all these parties, and he used to go in the closet off the Oval Office and engage in that kind of stuff. I used 3 primary sources for people that worked in the White House, including Harding's top Secret Service, who wrote a memoir, who said none of that stuff happened. There were no women came in the White House to see the president. Agent Starling, the Secret Service agent, said in his memoir, he said, the worst thing that he did that I saw him do is he mildly cussed at a golf ball, which he liked to play golf. And anybody that plays golf, you have to practice your cussing before you start playing golf. This is a frustrating game. He said he mildly cussed at a golf ball, and he played a little bit of poker with his friends. That's the worst thing I saw him do. He said that he did not go to anywhere to meet women. Women did not come in the White House. So again, you got others that work in the White House too. One was the White House doorman, and he said nobody came in here. They would have had to come past me, and nobody came in here to see Harding. So when you actually look at the sources, where do the stories come from, and what do people that are in the know? What do they know? That's how you can untangle a lot of these, and that's one of them. Again, that doesn't excuse his earlier behavior, but again, as president, he wasn't engaged, and that even stopped drinking. When he was president, played a little poker in the early days, did not engage in any of that. After a while, he stopped doing that. He was the the president of the United States. So a lot of this stuff about these wild parties in the White House, there's none of that. There's no truth.
What were the circumstances surrounding his death? Was he in poor health? Did it come out of nowhere?
No, it didn't really come out of nowhere. As a matter of fact, Florence, his wife, before he was running, we was thinking about running. And when he got the nomination, running the campaign, she was concerned. She even talked to some of their friends and said, I'm just concerned he won't survive even one term as president. She ended up being right. His blood pressure was on the rise. And his father was a physician. That's the interesting. But he had a bad heart. He had heart trouble. Of course, in his earlier days, smoking and drinking and partying didn't help that kind of stuff, even though he slowed a lot of that kind of stuff down. The pressures of the office, we tend to think, the president has a lot to deal with today. And it's a tough job. For anybody, it doesn't matter who it is. Just as tough then. He's dealing with all of these problems, and there's a lot of pressure. One of the reasons he went on that Western swing, kind of to get out of Washington, to get out of the White House for a while, take a train trip, go out and see people, which is something he really liked to do. And it was on that last leg of that Western tour, they were coming back down the Eastern Seaboard, he began to complain about being sick. And of course, the medical industry had made a lot of strides in those days. Of course, it's nothing like today. And of course, they thought he had eaten some bad seafood. Hey, you just probably got some seafood. It's, rest for a few days and you'll be all right. And of course, they brought in some other doctors later on, some heart specialists. I said, no, it ain't bad seafood. He's had a heart attack. We got to get him somewhere and get him some rest. So they had a hotel room in San Francisco. He was there for a few days resting and just suddenly had a stroke and died. And of course, the myths and the rumors surrounding that was that Florence had found out about the affairs and some of this other shenanigans, and she poisoned. Which is completely ridiculous. That crazy rumor came out by a guy named Gaston Means, wrote this book called The Strange Death of President Harding. He'd actually been a federal agent, but no serious scholar gives anything he says any weight. Even Edmund Starling, the Secret Service agent who had said those things about Harding, had wrote in his memoirs that he was a other people that did not like Harding really got upset at that type of race. There's no basis in that. And he didn't kill himself. That was another thing. Simply had a stroke and died pretty quickly there in San Francisco. But again, he brought his body, of course, back across the country. And there was a major outpouring of love and support for Harding. Most people said it was the biggest crowds for a presidential funeral since Lincoln was assassinated in 1860. Remember, Harding was popular. Harding got over 60% of the popular vote in the election. And was very popular on his death. Of course, I know a lot of the scandals came out after he died, and that sort of hurt his reputation. And that's really where it began. So for the last 100 years, you've had nothing but, well, we found out later how bad Harding. And Florence died the next year in 1924. They were buried in Marion. They later built a memorial to him and put him there in Marion. And when Calvin Coolidge was president, that's when the scandals were really rolling and they were prosecuting people. Coolidge refused to go and dedicate the memorial to Harding because it would have looked bad on him politically. It was not until Herbert Hoover in 1931 that he went and gave a really good speech about Harding at the memorial to dedicate it finally. So we've been trying to battle these myths, and I say we, this me and 2 or 3 other people trying to battle these myths because so much of it is it's just myths, it's rumors, it's just when I told people I was doing this, I got these strange looks. And why do you want to do that? Wasn't he a bad president? Wasn't he scandal ridden? Didn't his wife kill him? All these kind of things that they heard their history teacher or professor say, and he didn't know any more than anybody else did. You just have to really dig into the sources and look at his entire presidency and what he was up against and what he did. Revived the economy, restored domestic tranquility, restored our foreign affairs, all these things that he did. Which is exactly what we should want a president to do. So the reputation he's got is certainly undeserved. Now, I'm not saying let's put him on Mount Rushmore, you understand. I don't think anybody, will be honest with you. But I think in my mind, he's at least a good president. I think he should at least be in the top 10.
That's what I was going to ask, is that he's always in these presidential rankings, which I've said in the past, I think they're a farce in a lot of ways, and they're in too many ways reflect what historians' modern political views are, more so than understanding someone in their context. How should we understand Warren Harding in his context, and what can we maybe learn from him to apply to today and reevaluating him?
Yeah, the rankings are bad. If you look at all of the rankings, the major rankings, Harding has finished last in more of them than anybody else. Right behind him be James. Now, the most recent one by C-SPAN last year, Harding was like 8 from the bottom. So he'd actually come up about 8 spots, but he's still in the bottom 10. So, yeah, I think there's a lot that you can learn, putting him in his proper context and, actually looking at what he did as president, as I mentioned before. What is it that we want the president to do? And Harding was not looking at it like this, like Wilson would, or Teddy Roosevelt, or later Franklin Roosevelt, say, hey, we need to remake the country and transform it and that kind of thing. No, we don't need to do that. That's not what the president's supposed to do. He came in and modeled himself on exactly what the presidency was, as laid out in the Constitution, as laid out by the founding fathers. He runs the executive branch. And he said, he said at one time, which is a great line, he said, the world needs to be reminded from time to time that not every problem can be cured by legislation. The government can't do everything and fix everything. Sometimes we, the people, just have to fix our. So he came in with that mindset and said, we're going to do things that work, and we're going to return to normalcy and do things like we used to do things when depressions come and there's problems in foreign policy. And that's how he did it. So when he's returning to normalcy, he's rewinding the clock and not just settling everything down, but returning America to what America was supposed to be. And what's wrong with that? So you have to look at it in that way. Who's doing these surveys? Who are they surveying? Well, they're surveying academia. We know 85 to 90% of every professor in the country is a progressive liberal Democrat. So you're not going to, if you're a liberal Democrat, you're not going to like Harding. You're going to put him in the bottom. You're just not. And so, and most of that is they're dominated by that. And other scholars have said the same thing. People that admire Wilson or FDR are not going to like Harding. And so they're going to trash Harding, and they're going to push all these rumors and myths as if they're fact, rather than trying straighten them out. So it really depends on one's worldview. Depends on how you see the world and how you see our politics.